We're just about ready to start, so people are coming in with their coffee, take their seats. So welcome to this panel. My name is Rami Khouri. I'm a senior fellow here at IFI and a professor of journalism, and I do other archival research. But the thing I'm really most proud of is that I was here at IFI when this project started, and I remember very well the days when Mahmoud and Diana and Mu'taz came to see me at IFI before we were in this big building and said, we have this archive and would you be interested in hosting it and developing it? And immediately we said yes. We were a very small institute then. We had like maybe 5-10 employees and a couple of rooms at the other end of campus, but we immediately recognized the value of this material and how AUB would benefit from it, and through AUB scholars all over the world. So we said yes, and we went to the library and the director and the Kaukab, and then Hannah was hired, and off we went. So I'm particularly pleased and humbled to see where it has reached, and the credit, as several people said yesterday, really goes to those incredible workers, the staff at IFI, in the archives, in the different library sections, the data people, the unbelievable technical work that has been done, and which has opened actually new frontiers in oral history archiving. And now the task, of course, for all of us is to take this material and go one step further and bring it to the world in different forms that can have a useful impact. So I'm very pleased to chair this panel. It's about oral history, pedagogy, and culture, which can mean virtually anything you want, and our panelists will talk about really fascinating dimensions, including resistance and decolonization and classroom applications. So their biographies are in the program. I'm not going to repeat them. So we will start with Chandi Desai, and each one will have 17 minutes, as we did before. And please, Chandi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to begin by congratulating the Poha team on this incredible project. It is such an honor to be able to participate in this historic launch. Okay, so here it is. After the 1982 Israeli invasion of Beirut and the attack on the Palestinian Liberation Organization's research center, I went to the center shortly after and saw that the Israelis took everything. We, the PLO, had some Israeli soldiers at that time, so I called Abu Jihad and told him not to release their prisoners until they return our books, the library archives. Recall Sabri Jiris, the former director of the Palestinian Research Center, during an oral history interview I did with him in Fasuta. The treatment of a Palestinian library archive as a prisoner of war reveals the importance of historical records and cultural artifacts, as these materials enabled Palestinian revolutionaries to understand Zionism, develop counter-revolutionary strategies against it, while simultaneously develop, record, and preserve Palestinian history. These archives and other Palestinian historical materials have either been displaced, destroyed, and or held captive in the Israeli settler colonial archives, housed on stolen indigenous Palestinian lands, or have been neglected by the Palestinian leadership. And Hannah Suleiman's research on lost archives is very insightful on this topic. In the absence of these displaced materials, primary sources, and the ongoing memoricide and toponymicide and erasure of Palestinian history, amidst this, the repertoire could offer alternative or complementary perspectives to those derived from the written archive. Diana Taylor defines the repertoire as embodied memory found in orality, songs, poetry, dances, gestures, and movement. And I also consider the repertoire as these forms recorded. Palestinian cultural workers have been producing the repertoire in a dialectical process of struggle to record Palestinian history and identity against Zionism's ideological claim over the historical record. While oral history has proliferated as a methodology and practice in the context of Palestine, within the scholarly literature, there's limited discussion and theorization on cultural producers and the role they have played in recording Palestinian oral history through the repertoire, or how their repertoire itself can possibly serve as a site of oral history. In this very short presentation today, I will share a few pieces of data pertaining to oral history that I've collected for a book project I'm working on the radical tradition of Palestinian resistance culture, for which I conducted oral history interviews with 3 generations of Palestinian cultural workers, Jil al-Thawra, Jil Intifada, and Jil 9/11, which I define, the latter I define as a generation living in or holding citizenship in the racist settler colonies of Canada and the US. Today I will discuss artists that you will be familiar with. Nevertheless, I invite you to pay particular attention to the following 3 things, because it is beyond the scope of this presentation to discuss the history of resistance culture in its entirety, but the 3 things I want you to listen for is 1, the role cultural producers have played in recording Palestinian oral history, 2, the repertoire and how it can serve as a site of oral history, and 3, how the repertoire circulates across time and space despite the various forms of censorship, restricted movement, incarceration, and assassination that Palestinian cultural workers have endured. So during the 1920s, Palestinian resistance culture emerged in response to British colonialism in Palestine, though it was not called that at the time. Examining the repertoire of Noor Ibrahim, one of the most significant resistance poets of that period, can give us some of this oral history. Noor Ibrahim narrated his own lived experience as a fighter in the Al-Qassam brigades and the experiences of Palestinian Filahi, subjects to British colonial domination, through colloquial poems that he transmitted orally via live performance to the peasants. His poems Al-Arabi wa Shayuni, Fi Sabil al-Watan, Mr. Bailey, The Plan for Dividing Palestinians, Min Sijan Akka, discuss the modes of participation and popular resistance that Palestinians undertook during the British Mandate, including women's responsibilities in the resistance, Palestinian experiences of incarceration, British support for Zionism, and eulogizing martyrs. Noor Ibrahim's repertoire was easily learnt, orally disseminated among the villages, was used to mobilize the masses in the 36-39 Great Revolt, and still circulates today, and is a poignant example of records of oral testimony in the absence of many studies on the modes of organization and popular participation of the Great Revolt. After the 1948 Nakba, songs and poetry shifted to express sadness, separation from the land, exile, and trauma. Some of the songs sung by peasant women survivors were recorded by the El Fanoun dance troupe in the West Bank, which they have preserved in their musical archive in El Bire, and which has also been subject to many Israeli attacks, particularly during both intifadas, and there's a lot that they do to actually circumvent this. In an interview with Omar Barghouti, the former El Fanoun choreographer, he explains that some of these songs that provide the oral history of the Nakba were first danced to in the production Haifa, Beirut, and beyond. He says before that, the Nakba wasn't dance because dancers don't do that. Dancers do happiness, celebration. These sung oral histories enabled El Fanoun to not only revolutionize Dabke, but also transform the repertoire into an archive. So now moving to the period of the 60s, the establishment of the PLO, the defeat of 67, the rise of the Palestinian armed struggle instigated a resurgence of Palestinian revolutionary culture akin to the 1920s. Ghassan Kanafani played an important role in the production of this genre. In an interview with Kanafani's cousin Farouk Gandour a couple years ago, he explained Kanafani's obsession with oral history. Gandour recalls Kanafani speaking to and interviewing as many people as he could, family members, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and anyone willing to share their memories of the Nakba and pre- and post-Nakba with him. Gandour shares that Kanafani kept notes of their experiences as well. Saed, a refugee woman's testimonies, had a tremendous influence on his cultural production. Oral history enabled Kanafani to produce an entire genre, which he termed resistance literature, Adab al-Muqawama, through which he wrote Palestine back into existence. Rosemary Saig, in an article on oral history, underscores that the notes Kanafani kept were wrecked in his office in the 1982 Israeli invasion and were never recovered, which is a tremendous loss to Palestinian oral history. Kanafani also introduced to the Arab world the cultural resistance of poets in the occupied homeland in 48, Mahmoud Darwish, Sami al-Qasim, and Tawfiq Ziyad, in his groundbreaking study, Resistance Literature in Occupied Palestine, 1948 to 66. While a lot has been written on these poets and intellectuals, how Kanafani obtained these materials, as well as Zionist literature, remained unknown. So I asked Farouk Gandour how he obtained these materials, and he recalls that a European journalist that was traveling frequently between Beirut and 48 would smuggle Zionist literature and also the repertoire from inside the occupied homeland and bring them to Kanafani. This suggests that internationalists in solidarity with Palestine during that period insurgently carried Palestinian artifacts, memories, and other materials through smuggling operations across these geographies. By making links to the inside, Kanafani was able to also build relationships with the poets inside and introduce and disseminate the repertoire and facilitate greater access of information about the resistance happening behind the Green Line. Darwish, al-Qasim, and Ziyad also used testimonies of their own lived experiences of life under Israeli military rule, censorship, and incarceration to construct national memory and identity to make Palestine knowable. In doing so, they produced public history of Palestine that reflected the collective experience and memory of a fragmented people and nation. And the works that really exemplify this include, for example, Journey of an Ordinary Grief, Memory of Forgetfulness, Forbidden Poems, Prisoners of Freedom, etc. Their oral repertoire was documented in textual form as a strategy for circulating and disseminating information about 48 to people in and outside Palestine, circumventing Israeli laws on restricted movement and censorship, because during that period, anything deemed nationalistic was forbidden, including producing local media. Therefore, the circulation of these texts was done in secret. Yaqub Hijazi, co-founder of Dal Aswar, the first publishing house in Akka, Palestinian publishing house in Akka, recalls that all the books that they produced about the works of some of these poets was done clandestinely, secret operations, because they were banned from distributing and publishing the books. He says we would do it secretly and transport and distribute them between 2 and 6 a.m., 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. from Akka to the West Bank and Gaza. Darwish, al-Qasim, Ziyad, along with Palestinian cultural figures and intellectuals, Emil Habibi, Emil Toume, Rashid Hussein, and others, use festivals, gatherings, but also another important venue, the Israeli Communist Party's journal Ittihad and Jadid, to document and publish their narratives and cultural work. Isolated from the Arab world, these cultural workers created what I'm kind of thinking through as revolutionary circuits of exchange comprising of their cultural and political writings, which enable them to share their testimonies from inside while linking their struggles to Arab regional developments and global decolonization struggles, particularly in Africa and Asia, expressing solidarity with those struggles during that period. Both the oral and textual transmission, cartographic exchange, and circulation of these cultural producers' repertoire had a tremendous influence on the resistance consciousness of Palestinians in exile. For example, in an interview with Kamal Khalil, leader of the Intifada music ensemble Baladina in Jordan, he recalls being imprisoned for his protest music by the Jordanian government in the aftermath of Black September. He encountered Tawfiq Ziyad's poetry for the first time in prison, and then composed music to Ala Jidda Zaytuna as a way to remain steadfast after being tortured. He orally transmitted the song by singing it repeatedly to his daughters who would visit him in prison. The girls would then go home, sing the memorized song to the singers in Baladina, who then performed this song, which gained widespread popularity among the masses. Here, Ashkur's concept of transgenerational transmission of memory is evident as collective memory of Palestine was passed to the Palestinian masses in Jordan through the repertoire smuggled from the prison cell and allowed the ensemble to reframe messages of national resistance at a time when the Fedayeen was expelled from Jordan. Moreover, the relocation of the PLO from Jordan to Beirut enabled the PLO to develop cultural institutions in Lebanon and circulate the repertoire more freely because of less censorship there compared to other Arab states, explains Dahoud Talhami, the former editor of Hurriya, in an interview. Cadres of the PLO and cultural workers used oral histories to produce the repertoire as well. To mention a few examples, 2 documentary films, Talazatar, produced by Mustafa Abu Ali and the PLO Film Unit, and Because Roots Never Die by Nabiya Lufti, were based on the oral testimonies of survivors of the Talazatar massacre. Also, a Feta ensemble produced a soundtrack called Palestine Lives, in which they recorded narratives of men, women, and children recounting experiences as refugees, revolutionaries, and their political aspirations for return and a liberated homeland. Novelists also use histories, oral histories. For example, Liana Badr used testimonies of survivors from the 1982 invasion in the balcony over the Furkani, and Ilyas Khouri used them for Bab el-Shams. Additionally, Naji Al-Ali, in an interview with the author Radwa Ashur, suggests that his cartoons are a chronicle of his testimonies, oral history, and Handala a representation of his memories, suffering, and the class struggle of the refugees in Lebanon. I traced the revolutionary circuits of exchange of this radical tradition and how it was orally transmitted in familial spaces when I did oral history interviews with the 9/11 generation. The intergenerational transmission of memories and passing down of the resistance repertoire was used as a pedagogical strategy for teaching Palestine to the 9/11 generation by their parents, in which women played a central role. This influenced the revolutionary consciousness of my interlocutors from GL 9/11 and led them to narrate their family oral histories in their cultural works. Rafif Ziada, one of my interlocutors, in her spoken word album Hadil, reflects the oral histories and gendered experiences of the women and girls in her family, and were therefore, and therefore she says, they were the most difficult for her to compose and recite. In her very powerful poem Cry, Rafif re-narrates her mother's multiple displacements, death of family members during the camp wars in Lebanon, gendered aspects of the revolution, and doctors' attempts at erasing her mother's memories by prescribing psychiatric drugs to her. Rafif expresses her mother's defiance of carrying 60 years of memories on her back and in her womb, suggesting that refugee women like her mom are memory bearers who are keepers, holders, and transmitters of knowledge, a task that is not solely for males, elites, or academics. Similarly, the spoken word poet Rami Khouri, in his poem Yafa, describes the memoricide of Palestine enacted by an Israeli cab driver that denied Palestinian cartography to him during a visit, saying that the cab driver didn't recognize Palestinian street names. To challenge Israel's Judaization and toponymicide of Palestinian geography, using his Teta's memories, Rami memorialized her neighborhood through visual descriptions of her home in his poem Yafa. However, this generation had trouble fully capturing oral histories in their essence, a spatial dilemma between memory and forgetfulness, a play on Darwish's text. So a spatial dilemma between memory and forgetfulness, a kind of Palestinian absented presence, was experienced by many in the 9/11 generation because of the following: stories that were deliberately silenced and not told to them by family members, some's inability to speak Arabic, and therefore their inability to understand oral histories, and the far proximity away from the homeland and family members. Also, the GL 9/11's geographic presence on the settler colonized lands of other indigenous peoples raised paradoxical ethical issues, which a few of them raise in their cultural work. For example, Rafif's poem, Trail of Tears, links the settler colonial, capitalist, imperialist intimacies between Canada and Israel in their project of eliminating indigenous peoples across territories from Turtle Island to Palestine, while simultaneously expressing solidarity with indigenous struggles for sovereignty. Nevertheless, the similarities of the resistance repertoire produced across the 3 generations is evident in their content, which is fundamentally anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. It refuses Zionist historiography, refuses settler sovereignty and futurity on Palestinian lands, and is committed to liberation. Through their cultural work, these cultural producers have recorded Palestinian oral histories, be they fragmented and in pieces, And their repertoire not only serves as a repository of oral history, but is a living anti-colonial archive that recounts Palestinian ontology that spans time, space, geographies, and even generations. I conceptualize it as a living archive because it circulates through soundscapes, texts, and digital files, and has traveled through revolutionary circuits of exchanges, shaping Palestinian consciousness and popular history worldwide. To conclude, the Palestinian Liberation Archives, after the 1982 Israeli invasion, that were treated as prisoners of war, as Sabri Juris mentions earlier, because they required safeguarding from the enemy. So I'm going to say that again. The Palestinian Liberation Archives, after the 1982 invasion, were treated as prisoners of war because they required safeguarding from the enemy. The uncaptive Palestinian archives and the repertoires that do exist and are in the making need to be protected before, too, they could become prisoners of war or could be annihilated, given the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project. Culture is an arena for struggle, emphasized Ghassan Kanafani. And similarly, I think oral history is also an arena for struggle, not only in documenting the past, but in politically imagining and recounting and thinking through a decolonized and liberated future. I think oral history can play a significant role in this political work. Thank you.
And Nadia Yunus.
Roughly 6 years ago, I was amongst a group of youth that collaborated on a fundraiser at Assembly Hall on this campus. After the success of raising $12,000, we opened the doors to Al Naqab Center for Youth Activities. We felt that we needed a space in Burj Barajni camp for independent youth organizers such as ourselves to do what we could to serve the community. We knew we didn't want to turn into another NGO in the camp for the mass depoliticization of political work that they contribute to. We were committed to funding it independently in order to remain accountable to our community rather than our donors. Since that time, the center has turned into a community space. The center's work serves and is served by a rising generation of youth in the camp through its cultural, educational, and sports programs. In my research, I would like to explore what it might look like to turn and transform education into an integral part of the Palestinian struggle, a struggle that seeks to liberate the land of historic Palestine from the various colonial and imperial enterprises. I will do this by focusing on the development and intended trajectory of the education programs at the center. I want my research to assist in an articulation of an approach to education that enables Palestinians to engage in praxis, to consider the historic political past, the current state of struggle, and open a space to imagine and work towards a liberated future. During my upcoming year of fieldwork, I will be assisting in the coordination of the education programs at Al Naqab. This is something that I have done on more than one occasion. This year, I'll be documenting a community-based initiative that utilizes education as a tool. This tool is intended to materialize a vision of a community empowered and liberated from the oppressive consequences of settler colonialism and imperialism, while confined to a neighboring Arab state, host state. I echo the work of Aziz Chaudhry and Salim Valley that too often such initiatives that remain on the periphery or absent from academia altogether, and the lessons learned putting theory that challenges dominant discourse into practice are not passed down to those that can benefit from it the most. Therefore, for the first time, I am attempting to reconcile my worlds of being a scholar of education and Middle Eastern studies and being a human and an organizer committed to the Palestinian liberation struggle. I sit here today contemplating the question, how can a research proximity Two, the research topic be utilized as a strength rather than a hindrance to their critical engagement. As a result of my proximity, I have personally been asked, how are you protecting the research against the influence of ego and your own perceptual limitations? To address questions concerning the credibility of my research, I want to remind us of the very nature of academia and research. There is a fear in qualitative research that if one is not objective, then their research will not be taken seriously or will be invalidated. It is disappointing that the more you come across or are perceived to be speaking with the credibility of objectivity or in proximity to power, the more your ideas carry weight within the academy. The researcher's relationship to their research cannot be separated from the power dynamics involved in knowledge production. I find the following quote found in Speed Bumps, a book by Michelle Fine and Lois Weiss, to be particularly compelling. Quote, while I recognize my overlapping insider-outsider status, I do not always trust my insider knowledge or theories. Sometimes I forget that I even have it, caught up in the ways of the researcher, the ways which tell us again and again that insider knowledge or any knowledge outside of academia is not valid or legitimate, pressed to conform to the social sciences mandates of objectivity and neutrality. I, like other researchers, have learned too aptly to suppress my insider knowledge, end quote. In the academy, we are forced to speak a language that was intended to exclude us, to borrow and adapt methods of inquiry that find their roots in our dispossession. We are asked to explain ourselves and justify our existence or relevance on a regular basis. Audra Simpson says, quote, the work of indigenous studies scholars rests upon empire as well, and through the vocabularies and analytics it put into play, end quote. While indigenous studies develop primarily in the context of Turtle Island or North America, the issues at stake often overlap with those of Palestine studies. We have few alternatives but to continue this uphill battle. That is, if we hope to play any role at all in the knowledge production of our struggles for liberation. The Euro-colonial legacy of research should always be highlighted, particularly in the case of historically oppressed communities. In Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said deems anthropology to be the field most closely linked with colonialism because of ethnographers' role in producing knowledge about the natives. In the introduction of Decolonizing Methodologies, Linda Tuohy Smith, an indigenous scholar from New Zealand, says that in indigenous communities, quote, research was talked about both in terms of its absolute worthlessness to us, the indigenous world, and its absolute usefulness to those that wielded it as an instrument. It told us things we already know, suggested things that would not work, and made careers for people that already had jobs, end quote. This sentiment could possibly be shared by all communities that suffer from being over-researched. Maysoon Sukkarieh and Stuart Tannock speak to the problem of over-research in Shatila. They acknowledge that while different methodological approaches can be developed to deal with the effects of over-research, such as participatory, action-based, community, indigenous, and insider research, these methods do not address the issue of research itself. Participatory research and newer methodologies are spoken of in a negative light by those interviewed for the article, saying that it requires even more time and effort to be extracted from them, and the product of research results in next to no return for the research participants. When I began thinking of my methodology, I considered participatory action research to be the only way. It is presented as a methodology that utilizes more caution and involves more community, which is something that was appealing to me. However, when it comes to the refugee camps in Lebanon, Palestinians are familiar with researchers' unfulfilled promises and hollow sentiments of solidarity. It is not surprising why the majority of researchers continue to be viewed in a negative light today. I seek to address the concerns voiced by Sukaria and Tanak in my research. It would be naive to think that research in any marginalized community can escape replicating power imbalances. They will remain present in the academy between the researcher and researched, no matter how sensitive the researcher tries to be. Today, I want to articulate why I feel it is necessary for individuals carrying out community efforts to be the voice in research that is for and/or about them. I reiterate the work of Noor Masalha that oral history or a history from below offers a path to decolonize research. Oral history within Palestine studies is more than just a methodology. Noor Masalha says, quote, "Erasing Palestine and appropriating its material and cultural heritage has been fundamental to Zionist colonial practices before, during, and since the Nakba," end quote. Therefore, Palestinian oral history is accompanied by a political aim, the aim of reclaiming memory from the erasures of settler colonialism. In a special issue of the Journal for Palestine Studies that was dedicated to Rosemary Saigik, Bashara Doumani and Maysoon Zakaria comment on her self-reflexivity. Quote, "Humble to a fault, discreet, unflagging in her loyalty to her friends, she does not ask the now standard reflexive question, how does my subjectivity affect my relationship to the subjects of my research? Rather, she poses the standard solidarity question, how does my work help or hinder the lives of my friends in the camp and the cause of Palestine," end quote. It is the latter question that guides me in my research. In an effort to decolonize research being done on Palestinians, allowing my fellow youth at the center to speak on their own terms will be essential. And that is why I aim for this, like the most of the work at Al-Naqab, to be a collective negotiated process. It would go against my work as an organizer to allow my academic work to put Al-Naqab at risk in any way. The center, although still relatively young, does have a story to tell. And in sharing the story, I plan on utilizing Audra Simpson's notion of refusal in her ethnographic calculus in order to allow the center to have the last say in deciding our own ethnographic limit. While thinking through an oral history methodology, specifically for research with historically oppressed and over-researched communities, it is necessary to address the limitations imposed by the academy. I see Simpson's notion of refusal to be key here. She says, quote, "My notion of refusal articulates a mode of sovereign authority over the presentation of ethnographic data and does not present everything. This is for the express purpose of protecting the concerns of the community," end quote. Although in my research, the researcher-researched binary is disrupted due to my proximity to Al-Naqab Center, I still anticipate the alien nature of field work to complicate my relationship with the team of youth at the center. Lubna Katami, a founding member of the Palestinian Youth Movement, discusses the struggles of doing activist research in her dissertation, which utilizes a transnational ethnography to examine Palestinians' youth articulation, participation, and theorization of politics in movement building. In discussing the utilization of the method of the interview in her research, she discusses the inorganic situation that it leads to. Quote, "Somewhere between start and pause and between the pen and the notebook, I lost myself. I was estranged from my people and struggle, and I too became illegible to them. Somewhere between start and pause, the formality I proposed and the structure of an interview shifted the places in which knowledge comes from and the audience to which it is directed, end quote. In many ways, what I will be doing in this research will be a continuation of what I have been doing since we started the center. I have been, past tense, responsible for the center's fundraising efforts since we began. And as a result, I have been in a position to share our story countless times. But when you include the tiny detail of the academy and knowledge production, there is no doubt that things will become more complicated. This is something that I intend to pay particular attention to in the study of the center. Since I might have been present for some of the activities that they may relay, but I need to ensure that they are able to sufficiently expand on their memories of the experience. Yeah. After spending 6 years actively working on becoming a functioning community center in Burj camp that works to address the needs and desires of youth in the camp, this is an opportunity to reflect, not only to highlight the centrality of community work to the Palestinian communities, but to envision a future that builds on the lessons learned in the process. Chaudhry and Valley provide a powerful response to neoliberalism's insistence on privileging the individual achievements over collective stories via their collection of the social movement histories. They say, quote, movements are not only significant sites of social and political action, but also, albeit contested and contradictory terrains of learning and knowledge production, end quote. They stress the importance and the value of knowledge that can be recovered from oral accounts, forgotten archives, and history from below the peripheries that are typically discounted in the dominant historical narratives of social struggles, or what the authors call neoliberalism's ahistorical denialism. I like that phrase, yeah. In this sense, Al-Naqab is part of history in process. And this research aims to utilize oral history as an ethnographic practice for documenting its efforts, or what Leila Jayusi terms writing the history of the present. Jayusi says, quote, here, the past is not nostalgic, but held as a resource and a landscape to be revisited in re-envisioning future, end quote. When I think of the work we do at Al-Naqab Center for Youth Activities, I see possibility. I see the possibility of young people having a voice in the camp, independent of political parties. I see the possibility of young people having a safe space that supports their developments into leaders in the community. I see the possibility of providing culturally affirming programming in the face of a seemingly hopeless situation. And I see the value of documenting this experience of possibility in my research. Thank you.
So my project is supported by the Poha Fellowship Program. And thanks to Kaukab and Hannah and Hannah from the libraries and Sarah very much for their support and in having me participate in this very meaningful project. So my project has basically been to create a Poha toolkit for teachers to use with students in the high school classroom. And Palestinian students in UNRWA schools would be the most the ideal students to use such a toolkit. So I'm going to stick to my script so that I can share as many Poha extracts from the collection with you, but just first to go over some of the main pedagogical reasons for having such a toolkit. First of all, because of Poha, because it is the systematically conducted and collected oral history projects, one of the few in the Arab world in an archive at AUB to showcase it, and it is now digitized, so Poha deserves as wide an audience as possible. And while oral history is one of the most accessible methods of research, once collected, its use and dissemination is often the most neglected stage of the oral history process, as Rosemary Sayegh mentioned yesterday. Oral history work reaches its fullest potential when it is as much about recording, collection, and preserving as it is about sharing findings. As such, a Poha toolkit gives agency to both teachers and students to participate with and make contributions to the archive by virtue of their very use of it, thereby making it a living archive. Secondly, of course, Poha in the classroom provides a much needed alternative, both in content and approach, to the dependency on traditional written historical narratives, more often than not, told from the perspective of the great men of history and focused on great events. Oral history, by its very attention to the individual experience, reverses the historical lens from top down to bottom up, providing a multivocal, multi-perspective, gendered narrative. Its immediacy and personality has the power to amplify history and infuse it with life in the narrator's voice, facial expressions, intonation, cadence, bodily gestures, and of course, individual storytelling style. So oral history's performative capacity gives space to the individual reenactment and reimagining that connects the past more closely with the present. Thirdly, a Poha toolkit would be a valuable pedagogical tool, a resource for teachers that offers a myriad of possibilities in its classroom application. Using an oral history collection such as Poha equips students with an interdisciplinary skill set that engages a wide range of critical thinking skills such as primary source evaluation and analysis, active listening skills, not to mention observing interpersonal, social, and interviewing skills. Practicing oral history also involves, as we've heard today and yesterday, empathy, respect, and graciousness. And in this sense, oral histories also showcase the personal contact and the intergenerational engagement that is so often involved in conducting oral history research. This experience can be transformative not only for students, but also for the narrators sharing the stories of their lives. Even if they've told them many times before. Finally, at least for the purposes of today, oral history provides historical content that is so often left out of the written historical record. As Alessandro Portelli puts it, what makes oral history different is that it tells us less about events than about their meaning. And this does not imply, of course, that oral history has no factual validity. Interviews often reveal unknown events or unknown aspects of known events. They always cast new light on unexplored areas of the daily life of the non-hegemonic classes. So in brief, the toolkit for the purposes of this project is limited for now to 2 preliminary chapters as a foundation, hopefully, for a more extensive toolkit. The first chapter is a basic introduction to oral history, addressing the fundamentals, the significance of oral history, and oral history's relevance to Palestinian history. And the second chapter comprises a unit plan of 5 classroom sessions based on a selection of 21 Poha recordings from 4 villages. I can talk about why those villages, but we don't have time today. But given the age of the narrators, this period of time is roughly from the early 1930s to 1948 within the Akka district of northern Palestine. So some of the lessons are involved around Poha itself as a collection, village character and identity, the placemaking process through oral history narratives, comparing village experiences, and of course, intercommunal relations, and of course, the Nakba experience. So in the remaining time, I'll share a few Poha extracts to illustrate the riches inherent to the collection and how very briefly they lend themselves to classroom use. So the first 4 extracts that I'll show are basically showcasing the patterns of everyday life, social cultural aspects of village life, and the individuality of Palestinian village character. Even though separated by only 3 or 4 kilometers from each other, they each had their distinctive characteristics, which are very visible in these oral histories. So.
كانت تشتهر البلد.
Some background music.
شو بتشتهر؟ البلد مشهورة عنا مي.
Is it loud enough?
اسمها عين العسل. هاي مي كانت كتير مشهورة، كانوا يجوا اليهود يعبوها بأنانة مثل مية الصحة وياخدوها. اسم المي عين العسل. هاي تيجي عليها بالشتاء تلاقي الهبال طالع معها. بأيام الصيفية يحط قطف العنب يشقق من السقوعة. كانت العالم يشتغلوا طول النهار، يجوا العصر على البيت مثلا ياكلوا، يتحمموا، يلبسوا ثيابهن. كان في ساحة كبيرة بنص البلد وفيها قهوة، تروح أزلام تقعد بالقهوة يتسلوا، يلعبوا وراء، يشربوا شاي، يسووا. هيك كانت طبيعة العالم.
بس لأنه كان المدرسة اللي عندنا مدرسة ثانوية، كان في حركة معاهم مع الأولاد الشباب تبعت المدارس، الأهل يجوا عند أولادهم. المدرسة الداخلية كانت مشهورة يعني. البصة بتتميز يعني أول شيء بلد فيه كل الأنواع المواسم غنية. بعدين الشعب عنده حرية، نلعب 7:30، نلعب الطرنيب، نلعب القمار، يلعبوا الطاولة. كانوا أهل البصة يسهروا للصبح يشربوا، يحبوا الخمرة كثير، كانوا يشربوا عرق بشكل ما بتصور عقلي اليوم، لحد اليوم ما بهذا. كانوا يشربوا عرق ويسكروا. عندنا قهاوي، كان 4 قهاوي بساحة واحدة، وقهوة بحارة الأسلام 2، وواحدة عند مدخل البلد. هاي قهاوي بس لتجتمع الناس تلعب فيها طاولة وتلعب ورق وتشرب عرق. كانت هاي البسطة كتير مشهورة فيها، وهاللي بده يجي يشم الهواء ويشوف حاله انه جاي ياخذ حرية بقى يجي على البسطة.
البسطة كان
مدرسة كانت في داخلي، واحد اسمه أستاذ يوسف من كفر شيمة، كان مدرسة داخلية يناموا فيها. بس إلى أسمة وإلى كيادة إلى تاريخ.
طب بالبصة كنتوا انتوا المسيحيين والاسلام عندكم حارات منفصلة ولا ساكنين بين بعض؟
لا خلط بلط، لا ما في حارات منفصلة، لا. قهوة في حوالي 9 قهوة في البصرة. نروح نلعب، فوت على القهوة المسيحية، نلعب أنا وياه الورق، نلعب أنا وياه الضامة، نلعب أنا وياه الظهر. ما في منها، فيش منها. 3 مخاتير في البصرة، 2 مسيحية وواحد مسلم.
احنا علاقتنا جيدة جدا كانت. احنا والمسيحية كانت علاقة جيدة جدا. انا بتذكر وانا ولد بايام عيدنا كان الجامع، احنا قريب بيتنا قريب على الجامع، فيش الا شارع بيننا وبين الجامع، لذلك كنت اشوف دائما واصلي وانا ولد حتى، وايام الاعياد وانا ولد حتى اصلي، وبعد ما كبرت اللي لفت نظري بعد ما وعيت اشوف الخوارني من الفئتين أرثوذكس وكاثوليك ييجوا على الجامع وحطوا لهم كراسي بآخر الجامع بيوم العيد يحضروا صلاة العيد. طبعا ما يصلوش، يحضروا صلاة العيد، وبس تطلع الناس تخلص الصلاة يطلعوا يهنوا الناس كلها على العيد. ويوم يصير عيد مسيحية يروحوا وجهة الإسلام، هالوجهاء كل البلد كمان يحضروا، يقعدوا بالكنيسة يخلوا صلاة ويعيدوهن ويهنوهن بالعيد.
I think for those of you that know Mahmoud Zaidan, you could hear his interview, his questioning there, so I think that's a very important part of the process to recognize as well. But anyway, using these extracts, again, students can collect and compare descriptions of different village spatial and physical features, including the surrounding geographies, their internal makeup, location of the saha, the number of mosques, church, schools, cafes, maqams, neighborhoods, and possibly draw the mental maps that the narrators conjure up and contribute to Ahmed's map project. They describe the kinds of social cultural traditions practiced, the nature of interconfessional relations, and by comparing findings of narratives from the same village, they can create a palimpsest of the village, reconstructing the sense of place and time conveyed through the narrators. This next extract is a bit longer. It's 3 minutes and 26 seconds. And again, Fawzi Kiblawi here segues from the village character to socio-economic restrictions imposed by British colonial rule that stifled Palestinian village economic life, here in the case of tobacco production, for which Tarshiha was known.
احنا اللي كان منطقتنا كمنطقة ترشيحة وجبل ترشيحة، القرى اللي حوالي ترشيحة أهم شيء عندهم زراعة الدخان. فزراعة الدخان كانوا يضاربوها، سلموها بالأول. كان في مسموح إنه الناس تفرم الدخان وتبيعه مثل ما بدها. يعني والدي علي أبو عيسى بهذاك الوقت 28 29 جاب ناس يفرموا الدخان على الوسائل اليدوية، الهاون اسمه، وعمل شركة، عمل بهذاك الوقت جمعية، جمع رأس مال وصار يشتري الدخان ويجيب ناس يفرموا بالدخان ويعبوا العلب الدخان. العلب الدخان العادية كان تقريبا شبيه إلها، وأنا وعيها كان بعد منها، بعد ما منعت الحكومة البريطانية في علب. فبس حكومة بريطانيا بعد 20 لغاية بقت مش منظمة حالها، بقت ماشي لغاية 28 29 حرية التصرف. ب 28 29 قالوا ممنوع التصرف بالدخان بهالطريقة، ممنوع فرم الدخان وممنوع بيعه. وكان والدي الله يرحمه بهذاك الوقت ما في مواصلات بين ترشيح وعكا، ما في سيارات، كان يركبوا على الخيل ينزل على عكا، من عكا على حيفا في مكاتب، يوصي على مصر، يجيب العلب الدخان الكرتون هذه مطبوعة الكنار والبلبل وشيء منه حط إلى ماركات من مصر، ويستنى يرجع كمان ليجيبوا يوصل اللي بده اياه، الكميه اللي بده اياها لتيجي من مصر على حيفا، ومن حيفا كمان تيجي على عكا، من عكا تيجي على ترشيح. كان مشقات بس برضه ماشي ويبيع ويستفيد، والجمعيه كانت تستفيد منها لانه جمعيه تعاونيه تقريبا بهذاك الوقت ولو على طريقه مصغره.
مين عمل الجمعيه؟
والدي علي ابو عيسى هو اللي عامله، وهو اللي كان يعني هو صاحب المشروع. والجمعيه التعاونيه باسماء مجهوله بس دافعين مصاري، دافعين مصاري كراس مال من هالناس اللي هالدراويش اللي معه 10 ليرات فلسطيني، اللي معه 20 ليره فلسطيني، اللي معه جمعوا ما بعرفش قديش المبلغ تماما، وعمل راس مال وصار يفرم وصار يبيع وصار عنده شغل كثير. اجت حكومه بريطانيا قال هذا ممنوع، بده اللي بده يعمل بده يجيب مجانات على الكهرباء، وبده يكون راس مال عنده، حددوا راس مال بهذاك الوقت. كل قضاء الجليل، كل لواء الجليل ما بيجمع هالمال اللي فرضوه، قرى ما فيش عندها المال.
قديش تقريبا؟
بفتكر 20-30 ألف جنيه استرليني أو 50، ما يعني مش متأكد من المبلغ، بس مبلغ مش قادر كل ترشيحة تدفعه، ولا كل القرى اللي إذا جمعوا الناس اللي معها مصاري مش قادر يدفع المبلغ الكبير هذا، ومنعوا وصاروا يرابوا الممنوع.
Okay, so this, again, extract is a perfect example of, the specificity that is inherent to these narratives, the years, the numbers, and it could be placed, again, alongside extracts that deal with other kinds of economic restrictions. For example, in the village of Azib, where oranges were prohibited to be, by the British to be sold, or the British importation of wheat from Canada and Australia that was sold at a cheaper rate and undercut the local Palestinian wheat production. So all of these really factor into perfect ways of using these narratives to, for example, teach about the causes of the 1936-39 revolt. And finally, two extracts, which I think I need to skip one, about the Nakba 48.
لما ما بلشوا يضربوا على البلد بالطيران وبالمدفعية وبالهاد، طلعت العالم على الزيتون، تحت الزيتون قعدت برية البلد. ايش المدفعية وبالهاد، طلعت العالم على الزيتون، تحت الزيتون قعدت المدفعية وتحت الزيتون، ايش بلش دمروها تدمير.
So sorry, I had to skip that a bit, but she is describing the destruction of Tarshiha, which is a village that her and her family went to escape Al-Kabri that was occupied, and then stayed there for 6 months. And now she describes the actual walking from Tarshiha to Lebanon in the experience.
كان بالليل وكانت ليلة الله لا يفرجيها لحدا، غريبة الشكل. حتى هاي الليلة صار عمري 67 سنة ما مرق علي ليلة مثل هالليلة اللي طلعنا فيها. هوا سخن سخن والقمر هيك، تحس غبار، تحس عبوة، تحس كيف شكل. كان من ترشيحة نزلنا بوادي بقولوا له وادي القرن يمكن. عكنت في الوادي قعدنا بدنا نستريح، الدنيا ليل. قامت امي حامله اختي، قامت اختي وحطتها على جنب، حطت لها تحتيها جاكيتتها ونيمتها. شوي امي قامت مشيت واتركنا انا وابوي واختي واخويا. قمنا احنا قلنا لنمشي، قمنا بدنا نمشي، ما انتبهنا انه امي متركه اختي. مشينا مسافة مثل هون ودنا، هناك التقينا بأمي في بير مي، وقاعد العالم طول من بير المي لا تشرب، ولا أمي قاعدة. طلعت فينا أمي، قال وين أختكم؟ قلنا لها ما هي معك. قال لا أنا أتركتها. قام يا حرام أبوي رجع يركض، لقى صريخة معبي الوادي والعالم مثل النمل من جنبه، بس مثل يوم الحشر ما حدا داير باله لحدا. حملها وجابها.
كيف اجوا اليهود؟ من وين اجوا؟ كيف قصفوكم؟
اجوا اليهود عن الرمل، عن نهارية، من نهرية. ما قلت لك انه قالوا ما حدا يطلع حرس وما حدا كذا وما حدا هيك، والعالم ما حدا يشتغل حرس. الساعة 3 بالليل بدي التكسير على الرمل. انقتل ابو الشيخ، انقتل محمود العبد عوض، انقتل بيطلع 5 على ظهر عالي، محل عالي هيك عن السيرني، جايين من هون ضفروهن قتلوهن، قتلوا 5 نفذوا. وانقتل من اليهود ناس. احنا كنا بالبلد عالي، الرمل تحتينا، طخ على الرمل على منطقة، بس صارت المتاريس تبعتك رايحة فش مأمن انت وقاعد. فبدت المعركة، ظلت المعركة للساعة 9-10 بالنهار وأكتر. معركة دايري، انقتل ناس وانقتل نسوان وانقتل زلام وانقتل كذا، بتعرف اللي وانقتلت ناس كتير. واللي قدر يطلع طلع، واللي ما قدرش يطلع ضلت كم اختيار هناك اعتقلوه هنا وضل كذا. كنت ارجع انا لهناك اشوف الاختياريه قاعده هناك وكذا.
So, in conclusion, what these extracts illustrate are the different kinds of remembering, different kinds of telling, the conjuring up of the natural and figurative landscape, people like ants in Sumayya's extract, and the soundscape of Muhammad's account, both conveying the immediacy of the moment over half a century ago, and both carrying the momentous weight of the Nakba. Both extracts, moreover, relate the battles, the resistance, and the violence involved in expulsion from Tarshiha and Al-Zib in this case, countering the dominant narrative that Palestinians fled their villages without a fight. All this to say that using Poha in the classroom affords a different kind of learning, a different kind of teaching that is experiential, interpretive, engaging, subjective, meaningful, and literally constructive. As Salman Abu Sitta and Noor Masalha note, 2/3 of the population of pre-48 Palestine lived in rural villages and had in 1944 a literacy rate of only 15%. As such, oral history is not just a choice of methodology for recording Palestinian villages, but its use, as Rosemary Esper points out, can represent a decision as to whether to record any history at all. Through their engagement with the Poha collection in the classroom, teachers and students can contribute to the history-making process by reconstructing pre-1948 Palestine history and perhaps start putting villagers and villages back on the map. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We started a few minutes late, so we'll go till 12:35, so that gives us about 15, 17 minutes or so. Open it up for questions and comments. Try to keep them short. Identify yourself so we can get more input from the panelists. Tfaddali. Yeah, but wait for the mic.
I have a question for Chandu. Thanks for all the presentations. Why in particular do you refer to the 9/11 generation? Why that point of reference?
Other comments, questions?
My question is for Nadia, and I was wondering if you can tell us more about the educational program at Al-Naqab in relation to what you said, and especially the history part.
I'd like to ask Nadia also a question. You mentioned that you hope that the project would allow the young people to tell their story independently from the influence of the older people. So is there an issue or something like that? You phrased it, they would have an independent voice. To have the younger people having their own voice. Is there an issue among a controlled narrative that's dominated by certain groups in the camps that prevents other people from telling their story? One more.
Yeah, sorry, my question is for Maria. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have some examples of this, if this has been used so far, and what the students have learned or how they've reacted to it. And if you could speak just a little bit, I know we don't have much time, but the choice of villages, because you mentioned that, and I think that's really interesting. In terms of determining which narrative as well is being told or what the students are hearing. So, and great work, thank you for that.
So why don't you go ahead and comment?
Do you want to go ahead? Me? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'll start with your question. Examples of this, no, this has not been used yet, but I hope that we can find places that we can. Sorry? It will be posted on the website. But I have used a different kind of toolkit with Lebanese high school kids in public schools and having training, working with their teachers to train them in oral history practices to go to their villages and interview the elders in their village about the Lebanese Civil War, because as you know, the Lebanese Civil War is not part of the national curriculum. So that was kind of it's definitely a totally different project, because here we're working with already an archive of oral histories, whereas the Lebanese public school project is collecting oral histories. But it's kind of similar in the sense of using oral history in the classroom and empowering students, whether through interpretation or through collection, and contributing to the history-making process. That project is still only in the 9 months. We're in the 9th month of that project, so we're still in the evaluation and collection process. But it's an ongoing project. So far, the response from the students has been really fantastic. They've been really, one question was, why aren't these things included in our textbook? Why are we not studying this information? This is what we need to know. This is what we need to learn. So it's just been empowering for them, and at the same time, just such a meaning-making process as well. The choice of the villages, I think, boiled down to the fact that I was just the thousands of hours of oral histories that are that make up the Poha collection are overwhelming in their imports, and there's no possible way I could have gone through all of them. So I had to make a choice. And I started out with the village of Al-Bassa because my husband's father happens to be from there, and I'd heard stories about Al-Bassa. So then I saw how many oral histories were related to Al-Bassa. I thought, of course, because most of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are from northern Palestine. And then the villages that surrounded Al-Bassa, I mean, there's more than 3, of course, but each one of those villages, Tarshih, Al-Kabri, and Al-Azib, had such distinctive characteristics. I mean, I was really blown away by how much texture and individuality each of these villages had, which I'd never known of before. So it was just really mind-boggling, process of picking that up, and I can only imagine how much more there is in these oral history, this collection. So and I think through the digitization process and the segmentation and the indexing, you can really mine them for, what you're looking for, because nobody has so much time to go through thousands of hours, except, of course, for the wonderful people who did do the indexing work. But this really does make it much more accessible, much more, tangible for use. So that's the short answer.
Of course, there is a great difference between the villages of the north and particularly.
I'm sure.
So the choice should give a chance to me.
Of course.
It's fascinating because I worked on those villages that you chose, which is excellent. I think I am loud enough. But it's fascinating because it's so true. I mean, Bassa, I've visited it recently. They've turned the mosque into a cow's. They have goats and
Wow.
So yeah, it's interesting if you could get now of what it is physically and reconstruct what it was.
Exactly.
Because this is what I did try to do to Haifa, were to rebuild. And in my thesis, I had to rebuild the map of the original Haifa. And then now they look at differently.
Yeah, wonderful.
Hi. So Hannah wanted to know a little bit more about our education programs, or more, she just wanted to give me the opportunity to share with you all a little bit more about our education programs. Our education programs at the center, they've changed throughout the years, depending on what we're capable of doing. When we started, none of us had any background in education, but we did see that there was a need of sorts in the community in terms of the UNRWA curriculum has its challenges, and as a result, our students have challenges pursuing things in life. The challenges, whether from the decline in quality or the content and curriculum in terms of relevance and things like that, we wanted to always reinforce Palestinian identity, and especially give younger generations a chance to learn about their identity in a way that is actually positive. So currently we have been focusing on students around the brevet year, because as we know, with the automatic promotion that occurs in our schools, you reach the brevet year in 9th grade, and then it's a very stressful year, and it's very challenging to pass the exam once you're not equipped with the certain tools to do so. But our main focus has always been at the center that we want to bring Palestinian history back to the classroom, but we can't do that if we have problems with literacy, for example. But there are lovely opportunities that I'm very excited to explore with Maria now, and bringing the toolkit to the classroom. That's all I'll say in brief. If you want to know more about the center, I encourage you to visit. I encourage you to see our website. I encourage you to donate, because that's what I always do. I ask for donations, so give us money. Yay! In terms of Rami's question and and having the youth having a voice. I think it is always important for younger generations, and especially learning how to, or not learning, or developing into leaders in the community. It is necessary for them to have a space. And the current state of the struggle, not many outlets for young independent voices, is what the realm of opportunity that I think that something like the center offers, and that's what I meant in that question. I didn't mean that there are particular problems between generations, but we know those exist. Yeah.
Speaking of generations, so the 9/11 generation, I guess there are two ways to think about why that particular kind of terminology. The first easy one is the way they come to poetry. 9/11 for all of them was the fundamental moment in which they come to articulating, their resistance through the spoken word. And in particular, why this is really important, being Palestinians in the context of the US and Canada, is the fact that Palestinian communities, Muslim communities, Arab communities, Arab American communities, Arab Canadian communities were targeted heavily during that post 9/11 period. But because of the trope of the terrorist, and I do a little bit in the dissertation, the historical kind of, ways that the terrorist has been constructed in US law, Palestine is central to how it has happened in the legal framework. And that legal category really got emplaced on Palestinians. And so Palestinians constantly needed to respond in every possible way. And so these young people really, at the time, now, they're much older. At the time, they were heavily targeted by surveillance agencies, visits made by CSIS, the Canadian Intelligence Services, the FBI, and other kinds of, bodies looking for intelligence on understanding who committed the terror attacks of 9/11. And so, and then the kind of racism that they encounter and all of the ways that they challenge this racism back. And this racism is very much rooted also within the settler colonial context of the Canadian and US state, both as imperial states, and the kind of way that race circulates and operates in that particular geography. It had very specific meanings for them. And so in one sense, that was the reason that categorization was used. But the other, which is where there's a little bit of a struggle, is that they come to consciousness not during 9/11. They respond to the geography they're in through the language of English, using the spoken word as a way to speak to, to people within the country that they're living in, not necessarily just a Palestinian audience. But when they come to consciousness at a very young age, and I talked a little bit about the centrality of the familial space as that. So there were moments where I'm like, what generation is this? If you were to trace it based on consciousness, they would actually perhaps be another kind of generation. But if you're tracing it based on the moment they come into their poetry, I think 9/11 seems to be a bit appropriate in terms of when they're born, and in terms of Palestinian political geography, perhaps post-Oslo or the Jil Oslo is a better terminology. So I explain this a little bit. I think a quick presentation is hard to kind of get the nuances, but there are various levels at which we can think of how we categorize.
Any other comments, questions? There you go.
I just want to thank Jatni for including Ghassan Kanafani and his research and his work with the Palestinian resistance literature. I think it's a very, very important part of the oral history. Not only Ghassan Kanafani, also other Palestinian researchers and so on. And of course also your mentioning of Saad, which is real oral history. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, we will break for lunch. Help me thank the speakers, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.